How did we get to the point where so many young Australians have lost hope in the Australian dream? The heart of this issue is this. Governments in Australia and around the world, frankly, have lost sight of the fundamental role of housing.
House prices are too high and rents are shooting up. Developers are declaring bankruptcy before finishing new homes, leaving new owners stranded. And there's the lack of quality and availability for both rental and social housing. My name is Matt Lloyd-Cape, and I'm the director of the Centre for Equitable Housing, an initiative of Per Capita. Our team has been researching the impact of poor housing for the past 15 years. And over that time, we've seen the Australian housing system come under increasing pressure, uncovered some damning trends, and heard the heartbreaking stories of those affected, as well as talking to housing academics, researchers, and organisations who are seeking to find lasting solutions to our housing issues. This is Homes Not Houses, an investigative podcast recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which puts the housing system under the microscope and examines the factors which exacerbate inequality across the nation. Join us for the 6-part series where we unpack the current housing crisis, how we got here, who wins and loses from the current system, what sort of better housing system could we have, and how we can get there.
Called a home. Called a home.
Having your own house is the whole one you get sense.
To own your own home, I think, is a critical part of Australian dream.
Episode 2. Location, location, location. Why are we in this situation? Let's think of this as a puzzle. The edge pieces are the mess we outlined in episode 1, our current housing crisis. But what are the pieces that make up the middle? Well, these include our relationships with land, from land banking to the way we've developed our towns and cities. There are investors and migrants and how they influence the rental sector. There are pieces representing the building industry and their capacity to meet demand. There are our governments and the billions that they invest in different housing programs every year. And then there are pieces representing the relationship between communities, developers, and the government. So how do we make all these pieces fit into a clear picture of the housing market? Let's start from the ground up. Australia is a big country, the 6th largest in the world in terms of land mass, with the 2nd lowest population density in terms of arable or usable land. However, the choices we've made in the past and the choices we continue to make about where we live, how much we invest in transport infrastructure between towns and cities, how we disperse services and jobs, it all means that where it's feasible to build is really constrained.
We have such a high proportion of national population in a few very large cities, most of which are located on the coast and can only expand in 3 directions, and have a relatively small periphery.
That's Hal Pawson.
In other words, the developable land on the edge of Australia's populated areas is a very small area compared to, say, the USA, where there's a far greater proportion of population scattered in many, hundreds and thousands of settlements, a sort of medium-sized tier of cities and many smaller ones. And I think that's an interesting hypothesis. And Lucy Ellis, who used to be at the Reserve Bank, is one of the people who has noted this, which perhaps explains why the dynamics of Australia's housing market have a certain uniqueness about them, apart from the sort of administrative and institutional special features.
Sydney, capital of New South Wales. Founded in 1788, it's Australia's oldest city. 670 square miles of city. And every work morning, the tide of people flows into the centre from the suburbs.
As of 2018, 71% of Australians live in a major city, with only 10% of the population living in a town of less than 10,000 people. The distance between our major cities and housing markets plays a huge role in the way that we invest in infrastructure and housing developments. The endless spruiking of high-speed rail projects that never seem to get off the ground attest to this issue.
I rather like the idea of a very fast train.
If we do not have world-class infrastructure, there is no future for the Australian economy.
So while we look like we have boundless space on the map, the amount of land that is appropriate or affordable to build on is limited. This will only get worse as the population continues to grow and climate change influences the landscape. All of this plays a part in how the market functions and dysfunctions.
Location, which is a core attribute of land, is fixed in supply or very, very difficult to reproduce. So geographical features like, for example, deep harbours, fertile land, these things are not only fixed in supply but scarce and only in certain locations.
That's Emily Sims.
My name's Emily Sims. I am the General Manager and also the Director of Advocacy at Prosper Australia.
Prosper is an independent think tank which focuses on the taxation of land and other natural resources for our national prosperity rather than on individual wealth. Their research has shown that land is not like any other kind of asset.
Whenever we increase our incomes, whenever we increase productivity, ultimately it enables us to bid up the price of land in scarce locations. Land has these really specific attributes. It's fixed in supply. Buy land, son, they're not making any more of it.
Housing is often presented as a simple supply and demand problem.
Independent writer and researcher Peter Mayers speaking there.
You know, like bananas. So if there's a cyclone in Queensland that wipes out all the banana crops, the cost of bananas go up and we eat less bananas and we buy apples or pears instead, right? But there's real problems with that analogy. First of all, you don't buy more bananas than you need because they just turn black and go smelly and you don't eat them, you throw them out. So you only buy a certain amount of bananas. But people might buy more housing than they need. They do it all the time. They buy more bedrooms, they have bigger houses, they have 2 houses, they have 3 houses, one in the country, one in the city. People over-consume housing and there's no disincentive to do that. The other problem with the banana analogy is that, yes, if bananas are too expensive, I can shift to apples. If rents are too expensive, I can't shift to something else.
Despite having a limited supply of space, a push for more new homes and apartment complexes is almost always the first solution touted. It's a market-first solution that excludes the possibility of alternative ways to reduce demand rather than increase supply. Alan Kohler touched on this in his webinar with Per Capita last year.
Whenever anyone officially in Canberra talks about housing, all they want to talk about is the supply, because doing anything really to reduce demand would be problematic. It would be painful in a sense. I mean, the other issue that would reduce demand would be to reduce immigration, and the government doesn't want to do that because businesses are screaming for staff.
Not only do we have issues of demand to grapple with, but supply is also highly volatile and can't respond immediately to demand. Ask anyone who's tried to nail down a developer for their completion date. In the 22-23 financial year, amidst rapidly rising rental demand, over 1,700 construction companies entered insolvency. That included major home builders like Porter Davis, whose downfall impacted thousands of people who had already invested in new homes.
Work has ceased immediately on 1,500 homes in Victoria and another 200 in Queensland. A further 800 contracts had already been signed, leaving people in the lurch.
The pandemic, inflation, and the war in Ukraine have all played a part in the collapse of these construction companies. In the year to June 2023, building costs increased by close to 8%. And some might argue that our really good health and safety regulations, which prevents people from building makeshift homes with reckless abandon, makes houses cost more to build. So why can't the market respond to demand? Well, some people say that the root cause is to do with councils restricting new construction.
This is a thin margin business, and especially in a high interest rate environment, we need certainty. My name is Jonathan O'Brien. I'm the lead organizer of YIMBY Melbourne. So when we're having these decisions be made at the last minute and be made for kind of arbitrary political reasons rather than reasons that actually have to do with the planning code, that uncertainty adds cost, and the actual knockoff of the yield adds cost as well.
While there may be some truth to this, these ideas are contested. Put simply, why would developers build low-cost housing when they can build for the top end of the market?
If you look at where construction resources are going. Plenty in our cities are going into high-end housing, to renovations, to expanding space.
That's Tim Helm. He's the Director of Research and Policy at Prosper.
So that's using our given construction sector size to produce less in terms of housing space than might otherwise be produced. So I think it's not just a problem of poverty, of incomes, but it's a problem of inequality, particularly, and we've seen wealth inequalities rise over the course of the pandemic.
And this brings us back to demand. While our economic model is built around high migration, another sector of demand really took off in the 1990s, investors, seeking to profit from our relatively small amount of usable land. From what we've seen over the last 3 decades, historic low interest rates have meant that it was kind of a no-brainer to buy investment properties because costs, including mortgage costs, could be offset against your top rate of income tax, and the capital gain was barely taxed.
This 4-bedroom family house is just one of the magnificent homes now available for inspection at West Melton, where we challenge the genuine home buyer to find better real estate value anywhere in Victoria. From as little as $3,000 deposit, now is the time to buy at West Melton. Visit the Oliver Hume Display Centre or see our ad in the real estate supplement of Friday's Herald. Isn't it time you made the move to West Melton?
But while this is beneficial to some, usually older, already wealthy people, it's created a class and generational divide.
Everywhere today, young couples are being lured by signs which promise them, if not the house of their dreams, then a house which so easily could become home. But to buy a house, the purchaser needs up to a third of the total price.
Currently, there are around 100,000 first-time buyers trying to get into the market every year. And they're competing with around 50,000 investors over the same housing stock. While investors tend to rely on their existing wealth, younger first-time buyers have to rely on insecure work and lower wage growth. This has led to the rise of the bank of mum and dad, particularly for children of existing homeowners. This fact further deepens the divide between those that can access home ownership and those struggling to find adequate housing. While it gets harder for young people and those in the lower income brackets to save for a deposit, homeowners can buy investment properties and offset rental losses at the taxpayer's expense.
We need to look at what's determining the incomes of the poorest, but actually with housing or with land, it's partly about the relative purchasing power. There's a fixed amount of land. Sometimes a city is described as a tournament economy. You know, the top 16 or 32 players at the Australian Open get some prize money, and it doesn't matter how good they are at tennis, right? They just need to be better than the others. And a city with its fixed land area has the same kind of characteristics. So as the rich get richer, any given level of income down at the bottom buys you less. So it's actually not just about the determinants of the wages of those at the bottom, but it's about the skyrocketing wealth of those at the top.
I mean, what it's given us, what it's given Sydney is a sort of what's still, I think, sometimes called the fibro belt, which is a sort of middle ring of suburbs where there's still a substantial amount of this housing. I mean, quite a lot of it's been redeveloped, yes, but I don't think that process is anywhere near complete. And those areas are ripe for higher density redevelopment. But it isn't going to come about, or it hasn't been happening at a fast rate through the market, except where single small homes are replaced by McMansions, which isn't really helpful to housing policy. And government hasn't really recognised the possibility that using planning powers and being taking a more interventionist approach might be necessary, probably would be necessary to do this at any scale.
The challenge with housing affordability has been an issue of gradually declining home ownership.
That's Eliza Owen, Head of Research at CoreLogic.
And that has simply stemmed from housing values outpacing income growth over time. So that's led to the emergence of what is known as a deposit hurdle, where as housing values rise, it gets harder and harder to keep up with those values and accumulate a 20% deposit with savings alone. That results in a longer term issue of not only declining home ownership, but declining home ownership among younger, poorer households generally over time, and a greater disparity between the haves and the have-nots, because you're more likely to get over that deposit hurdle if you have a windfall of savings, relatively high income, maybe help from mum and dad. We certainly hear a lot of anecdote around that in the housing market.
Many objections to increasing density relate to how this would threaten the quality of their community, and this is often aimed at apartment construction or social housing construction. That makes it harder for new homeowners, young people and lower income earners from living in established neighbourhoods, which are close to jobs and services, and forces them outwards into the great urban sprawl. In that sense, housing is both a symptom of and a cause of our rising wealth inequality. Housing-based wealth has been increasing far faster for older, richer Australians than for younger, poorer Australians. Most of the wealth that people have in Australia is based on home ownership and how much equity they have in that property. And the gap between how much housing wealth that older Australians have compared to younger Australians has been increasing rapidly over the last couple of decades. And this gap is growing even faster for rural and poorer people.
Getting into the market is harder. About 2/3 of us agree owning a home isn't really an option for young Australians anymore.
The number of investors in Australia has increased noticeably over the last 20 years. And there is much talk about the role played by investors, domestic and foreign, in this crisis. There is the practice of land banking, people hoarding swathes of land with the intention of subdividing and selling at higher prices when the market can bear it.
The problem is speculation or land banking. The problem is that the owners of that land don't have the incentive to actually convert that into housing quickly or to sell those lots at a price that's affordable.
That's Tim Helm.
That would cut the value of their remaining land banks if they have to cut their prices. So in our report looking at the rates of sales and the prices for these master planned estates, we found that these communities were typically drip fed. These master planned communities were drip fed to market over 30 to 40 year timeframes. And even when the rate of sales slowed, developers didn't lower their prices to try and keep up the prior rate of sales to speed up the rate at which lots were being bought. Rather, they just played a patient game of keeping the prices high and waiting for demand to return. So we need to remember too, this is generally farmland that with, I suppose, fairly minimal subdivision costs of providing the local roads and the rest, is able to be sold as housing lots. So the costs are far, far lower than the price that's able to be charged for this. So there's no question about the profitability or the feasibility of actually selling these. They could be sold at a far lower price. But because of that monopoly nature of land, there's no incentive to do that.
What is clear now is that the way we're treating housing is all wrong. It does not operate on the same logic as traditional markets. And while there are definite gains to be made from increasing density and overcoming overly restrictive regulations on how we increase density in our inner cities, we cannot rely on the private sector to build us a solution to what is a long-term social project, housing our growing nation. And while many policymakers may have forgotten this point, it was at the very heart of our response to the post-World War II housing crisis. In fact, by remembering this point and placing strong, long-term government planning at the centre of our housing policies, we've overcome previous housing crises in the past. Join us next week as we look at how. This series is a production of Per Capita, an independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community and social justice, and we're committed to providing ad-free, editorially independent content. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present.